Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to be talking about Chapter 5, which is all about directive listening skills. So, as in Chapter 4, tracking or pacing the client is some of the most important jobs that we're going to have as a client. Other times, you'll want or need to be more directive with your clients. As we talked about in Chapter 4, there are certain cultural, gender, and emotional needs that our clients may have that are different from our own that will prompt you to have to be more directive. So this chapter, we're going to learn about the different directive listening skills. So by the time this chapter is done, you'll be able to describe the purpose of directive listening behaviors. You'll be able to apply directive listening behaviors during clinical interviews. You'll be able to apply direct questioning to an ethical manner by empowering clients to explore specific actions and identify ethical and cultural issues that can arise when using directive listening skills. So let's first talk about directive listening behaviors. When we think about directive listening behaviors, they're considered skills for encouraging insight. And these are often advanced interviewing techniques that can encourage clients to examine and possibly change their thinking or behavior patterns. What you do with directive listening behaviors is to essentially have your client dig deep within and either become introspective and then communicate their needs, or reach into themselves and then externally communicate, whether it be in the form of a story or in the form of some type of narrative, to communicate what may be happening for them. So when we think about directive listening behaviors, they include feeling validation, interpretive reflecting a feeling, interpretation, either psychoanalytic or reframing, confrontation, immediacy, and questions. Always remember, validation is different than reflection. When we think about validation, the definition of validation is the action of checking or proving the validity or accuracy of something. It's also recognition or affirmation that a person or their feelings or opinions are valid or worthwhile. So validation will typically occur when you acknowledge and approve of the client's emotional state. Again, it's about us being objective, not subjective. The feeling of validation can help clients accept their feelings as quote unquote normal, common, or even natural. Feeling validation can enhance therapeutic rapport, but also foster client dependency. So when we think about validation, remember, we have to use it like any other technique when it is appropriate for our clients. Offering too much validation may actually cause your client to not only become dependent on you to now make all the decisions or many decisions in their life, but can then cause them to intellectualize their issues or concerns rather than look at the feeling or the emotions that are attached to it and actually process and do the work. Interpretive reflection of feeling is sometimes called advanced empathy. And as we had talked about in chapter 4, that when we think about empathy, we are looking at the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. So this is the advanced ability to understand and share those feelings. When we think about empathy, remember that there are also different types of empathy. And empathy in and of itself, it can be cognitive, meaning it's more perspective taking. And it's basically being able to put yourself into someone else's place and see their perspective. It can be emotional. That's when you quite literally feel the other person's emotions alongside them, as if you had caught up or got caught up or have become caught up in their emotions. And it can also become compassionate. Compassionate empathy is the type of empathy that is usually most appropriate because it's essentially feeling someone's pain and then taking action for help. So this interpretive reflection of feeling goes beyond surface feelings or emotions to uncover some of those deeper emotions that one's experiencing. And this technique can produce very strong emotional insights. And for some, if your client is not ready to address it and they're used to either repressing their emotions or avoiding their emotions, they may become defensive. So when using interpretive feeling of reflections, you want to wait for 3 things. One, that you have established good or positive rapport. Two, your client feels heard. And three, you have supporting evidence. To tell your client that, based on their problem at work, for example, as we talked about in chapter 4, we talked about a client who had a really awful day at work and there was a lot of tension. What if the client was the one causing the tension at work and then was kind of putting their hands up and playing the role of the victim in this? So you want to make sure that you have an established rapport, that you can help your client to feel heard and your client truly feels heard, and that you also have supporting evidence to back up what it is that they're saying. Because by you validating the behavior that they engage in, where they come in and they cause a lot of drama or problems at work and then stand back and play victim, that can actually do the opposite of what it is that you intend to do in counseling, which is to minimize or mitigate some of those negative behaviors or unhealthy behaviors. Interpretive feeling reflections also should be stated tentatively and offered collaboratively. So if your client is having a hard time putting words together, maybe an activity that you can do with them is to come up with a number of different emotions that coincide with smiley faces. And then ask your clients, what emotion do you feel might best represent how you're feeling right now? Pick a few of them and then let's talk about it. Interpretation. There are two main types of interpretation. There's the classic psychoanalytic technique that's designed to produce client insight, and a cognitive behavioral or solution-focused approach that is designed to help clients see their problem from a new and different perspective. So when we think about interpretation, remember, this is the unprepared patient who can in no way connect the words he hears from the analyst with their emotional experiences. Such a quote-unquote interpretation does not interpret at all. So you want to make sure that as you are engaging in interpretation, that the client isn't using their words or intellectualizing in a way that can actually cause them to not really interpret at all, but rather stay either totally in their emotional experiences or completely be devoid of their emotional experiences. A trial interpretation is a statement that tentatively connects present behavior to past behavior, and the focus is usually on repeating interpersonal relationship patterns. Before you really dive into this, you want to make sure that you ask permission of the client and that you state your trial interpretation gently. So a way to be able to do that is, wow, it sounds like you had a really awful day at work, and that the tension was so great that you could, or so large that you, or thick that you could cut it with a butter knife, but still you made it here today. If it's okay with you, I'd like to try to explore how often this happens. And as you're going through that questioning, gently ask the client, does this happen a lot? How often would you say it happens in a given week or a given month? How long does this tension last? And then start getting that information. And once you're able to connect a pattern that, there's a lot of tension-filled days at your client's job, it could be that they're causing the tension. It could be that they are feeding off of the tension. It could be that they're on the receiving end of this tension and it's really against their will and it's causing them, distress and undue distress. So getting this interpretation and asking questions that can help guide your client can be helpful in understanding the full scope of the picture. There's also reframing or postmodern interpretations. So reframing is used when you believe your clients are viewing the world in a manner that's inaccurate or maladaptive. So through interpretation, if you find out that your client is causing a lot of the tension at work, you might try to gently get them to think about that. So you may say something along the lines of this, and I'm thinking off the cuff. Wow, it sounds like there's a lot of tension at your job, but from what you've described, it seems like there's really tension with just one other person. When you think about, or when we think about the tension that you're experiencing with this other person, what is happening that the person is causing you to experience this tension? And then you get their answer, and then you can ask them back, what are you doing to continue to engage in the tension? Or what is causing you to continue to engage in that tension? This is a way to effectively reframe, especially if there can be an alternative, that for every action, there's a reaction. So if someone is bothering your client and then your client is going back and bothering the other person, and then it's just going back and forth and it's causing tension, and that tension is causing your client distress, well, it takes two people to engage. If one person disengages, then that dyad has broken and there can no longer be tension. So part of interpretation can be reframing, especially if your client is actively engaging in maladaptive behaviors. Then we have confrontation. This is a form of reflection or feedback that articulates the client's perceptual inaccuracies or inconsistencies, and it often involves you being forthright in the kindest way possible, pointing out their discrepancies. Confrontation will work best when there's a positive, therapeutic, and working relationship, or there's a lot of credibility within yourself. You have to be very confident if you're going to confront a client. You can't go in meek or mild or with any trepidation, because your client will often feel it, experience it, and feed off of it. Confrontation can be anywhere on the continuum from gentle to harsh. An example of confrontation can look like this on either end of the spectrum. It sounds like there's a lot of tension that's happening at work, and it sounds like it's really causing you some distress. What is something that we can do to help minimize some of that tension for you at work? And then you can explore those options with your client. That's a more gentle way of confronting a client. A harsher way is, it sounds like from what you've described that both of you play a role in the tension that's being created at work. And it sounds to me, and from what you've reported, that it's causing you distress. So what can you do to minimize the amount that you engage so that you can reduce the distress that you have in your life? We also have immediacy. This involves an integration of here and now self-disclosure, feedback, and confrontation. And it's very flexible in the sense that the way in which the therapist responds can be used for different purposes. But it's also risky because it's intense, and therapists may focus too much on themselves and their reactions to the client, which is bordering countertransference. So an example of immediacy might be, wow, there is a lot of tension that's going on in work. And you know what? I get what it's like to have to deal with that kind of tension, or I understand what the feelings of distress can do to the body. It can really be a lot. So here's some more immediacy examples. As I listen to you talk about the abuse you've experienced, I feel admiration for the strength I hear in your voice and in your stories. Or you say you want your roommate to be neater and more respectful of you in your space, and yet you talk about it in here. It feels almost like you're a helpless child instead of the competent and resourceful adult I've come to know. So I'd love for you to think about, how are these examples different? In short, the top example is more gentle and the bottom example is a little bit harsher. But ultimately, they reach the same thing. It's about making your client understand that you too can be with them and understand what it is that they're doing. So it's a form of validation, but you're doing it in a way that is putting you in, but also you kind of dip your toe in and then you take it out. So like with the example I just talked about, like, wow, I understand what that kind of distress can do to one's body. And it seems like, you've been working on trying to minimize some of the distress that you're experiencing. What are some things that you've been able to do in order to work on that distress that's been helpful? So if our goal was to talk about coping skills, that's a really great segue. Putting a little bit of immediacy in, and then you're coming out. When we think about questions, often questions are going to do a number of things. Not only are they going to stimulate your client to talk, but they can have the opposite effect and prevent your client from talking. It's also to help facilitate rapport between you and the client. It helps you to show interest or even disinterest in our clients. gather information, confrontation, focusing and co-collaboratively discovering solutions, and it can also ignore the client's viewpoint. So we have to be very careful in the questions that we ask and the ways in which we ask them. So we're going to talk about different question types. We're going to look at open and closed questions, swing questions, indirect or implied questions, or projective and presuppositional questions. So open questions and closed questions we know a lot about. Open questions are essentially designed to facilitate your client to talk, and they usually begin with how or what. You want to minimize using the word why, because why can cause your clients to feel defensive. For example, if I were to say to my client who came in with the stressful workday, why do you allow this person to continue to do this to you? And why do you engage back? Listen, if that doesn't put a client on the defensive, I don't know what will. But if you say something along the lines of, how do you think we can come up with a plan together to help minimize the engagement, therefore minimize your distress? You're asking the same question, but you're doing it in a different way. And it can allow the client to not be defensive and causes the client to start thinking about themselves and a solution. So now you're empowering your client. Closed questions, very simply, yes or no responses. So you're very much directing and leading the client to more specific responses. And they usually will begin with words like do, does, did, is, was, and are. So here are some examples of open and closed question samples. How are you feeling about therapy? Versus, are you feeling good about therapy? How do you feel versus do you feel angry? The open questions allow the client to elaborate more, whereas the closed questions are very much like yes or no. Very, very direct and to the point. Then we have swing questions. And these can answer be a yes or no, but are designed to produce a more elaborate discussion. And these will start with could, would, will, or can. And you want to use them when you have some more rapport. So an example of a swing question could be, could you see yourself being able to go to work and not engaging with your coworker, therefore minimizing the distress and frustration that you're experiencing? So that could be a yes or no question. Most often, people are more willing to then elaborate on it. Well, yeah, and I've been trying, but it's been really hard, and I can't get her to leave me alone, and she keeps coming after me. So the swing question can allow you to not only have that yes or no, but then produce a bit more elaboration. Then we have indirect or implied questions. They usually begin with, I wonder, or you must, and they're leading, but not speculating. It can feel very manipulative to the client if it's overused, so use them sparingly. So you might say something like, I wonder what it would be like to be able to go into work tomorrow and there is no tension with your coworker and you experience no distress. What would that look like? What would that feel like? And now you have your client talking about what it would look like and feel like. Finally, we have projective or presuppositional questions. And this helps clients to identify, articulate, and explore some conflicts, values, thoughts, and feelings that may not be clear. So they might say one thing and then say something different, or they might say something and then their body language says something else. So usually this is going to begin with a what if, because then it invites the client to speculate based on your what if. And it can also be used to evaluate client values and judgments. So if I were to say to my client, what if you went into work tomorrow and when your coworker tried to engage with you, you did not engage back? What would that look like? What would that feel like? What if? And then let your client go from there. If your client's like, F that, I'm always right, and that person needs to be respectful to me, and I'm gonna make sure that they're respectful to me, that says a lot about your client's values. But if they're like, well, I haven't really thought about that. It's never crossed my mind because since I started working there 6 months ago, everyone's been on edge because of the Rona, and we've never not had a day where there wasn't tension or something that would cause an issue. So now you get to explore that more with your client. So remember, there's benefits and liabilities of questions, and we're going to be doing something like this in class together. So when we think about guidelines and using general questions, you want to make sure that you prepare clients for different questions and don't use questions without non-directive listening. Your behavior and the words you use mean something. Your body language is attached to it. Just like we talked about in chapter 4, that your body language means something, but the way in which you communicate and the words you use also mean things as well. You want to make the questions relevant to the client concerns and goals. If your client's talking about being frustrated at work, and in another section, they talked about weight loss, but the bulk of their session has been about this issue at work, and you go and ask them about weight loss, the client's not going to feel supported or validated. So make sure that you are staying relevant to where the client's at. If your client is all over the place, it's okay to say, okay, let's take a step back for a second, because we've talked about a number of different things, that reflection question. I want to make sure that we're on the same page as to the issues and concerns that you have, and then you can talk about it and get your client to clarify and make sure that what you're reflecting is accurate. You can then ask your client, what issue or concern is most pressing to you now? And then get them to think about that. You also want to use questions to elicit some concrete behavioral examples. So that issue that person's having at work, there are some concrete behavioral things that you can do to minimize your client's engagement, as well as incorporating coping skills and stress management techniques, as well as effective critical thinking and decision-making skills. So therefore, they may not be as likely to engage in behaviors that causes distress and tension at work, and can then minimize some of the concerns that they have around work. So make sure that when you're asking questions, that this can not only be relevant to the concerns and goals, but that behavioral example is going to be eventually part of your treatment plan. And make sure that you approach sensitive topics and areas cautiously. You don't ever want to assume. If someone discloses, for example, abuse, you don't want to assume that they're willing to talk about it and that the way that they handle it would be the way that you or anyone else would handle it. So, especially in the client interview, exercise caution with sensitive topics. So let's talk about some ethical and multicultural considerations when using directive listening skills. As we had talked about with non-directive listening skills, that there are certain gender, cultural, and emotional viewpoints that may be different from yours. So it may be that they do either employ or that they do need more directive skills, therefore you are more directive, or the total opposite, where you are less directive. This will also be this will also lead into how you will ask questions. So some clients, like Native American, Asian American clients, they need more authoritarian types of questions. So it's going to be more close-ended questions, whereas others might want more open-ended. So it's about becoming familiar with what your clients need and kind of gauging the process with them. Some questions clearly lead clients towards a specific action. We have to make sure that it's co-collaborated and that it's not just you thinking that this is the most important issue. Here's an example. I had a client come to me many years ago, and I did get consent a while ago to talk about this from my client. But I had a client who came to me and said that they were having problems with their relationship. And I won't even specify what kind of relationship, because it could be any kind of relationship, but this client was having a problem with a relationship. And the way that the client talked, it seemed as if the relationship was the major issue. But towards the end of the client intake, I realized that that wasn't in fact the major issue, and that all these questions that I had asked in relation to who they are and what things they wanted to work on were not necessarily related to the relationship as much as it was a loss that they had experienced several years prior that wasn't fully worked through. They were still experiencing grief and bereavement, and the grief and bereavement was coming out in the lack of communication within the relationship. So you don't ever want to lead your clients towards something that you feel is what they need to work on. It needs to be co-collaborative, and it needs to be done constructively together. Again, we want to make sure that you are, again, let me go back for a second. You definitely want to make sure that if you are nervous, especially as you are first practicing, that you prepare some questions for your clients. You typically get a little bit of information about them, so maybe you might want to write some questions down. A combination of open and closed questions, maybe some swing questions, and some projective questions and presuppositional, the whole gamut. You want to make sure that each one of these questions that we just discussed, that you have an opportunity to ask some of these questions, and that in asking these questions that you have some that are prepared. So if and when your clients come, because sometimes clients don't show up right away, sometimes they're late, sometimes they reschedule, but when your client comes, that you have a series of questions that you can ask them, and then based on their responses that can gauge what additional types or like-minded questions can you ask. So I hope that this was helpful for you. Some things to think about. What felt most important to you from this chapter, and what is it that you want to remember? How can you apply the ideas from this chapter into your clinical work, either if you are presently in clinical work or for your future practicum and internship opportunities? If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me via email. Also, don't forget, in the description box below is an extra credit question. You can earn up to 1 point added to your final grade by answering the question below, taking a copy of your taking a screenshot of your response and uploading it online. Do it by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. and you can get up to 1 point added to your final grade. Until next time, have a great one and take care.